What is a good asset allocation heading into retirement? We're going to run some numbers for you. I'm not a financial advisor. I just love to set up spreadsheets. Often people recommend a 60-40 split. In other words, 60% staying in it. The account we use is an S&P 500 account because that's what everybody's trying to beat. And that's what we have 100 years worth of data to use. So that's why we use it. Uh, so we're going to look at if you left it all in the stock market, if you did it 90-10, 80-20, and so on. We're going to get down to the 64. We're just going to run some numbers for you. Again, it all depends on what's going on those initial years. They call that sequence of returns risk. We know the stock market has ups and it has downs. This is the last 100 years worth of data that we use from the S&P 500. Nobody knows what the future is going to hold. We don't know if we're going to have a bad decade like the 1930s or the 2000s, or some really good decades like the 80s and the 90s. But we really want to key in on this recent decade of the 2000s. And we're just going to run some numbers using what's happened in the last 25 to 30 years. So let's say somebody has 750,000 saved up. Let's say they're 62 years old and they open up their Social Security statement, and if they retire right now, their full retirement amount would be 2,600, so they'd get 70% of that 2,600, so they'd get 1,820. So we're going to say they're taking that right now. But first of all, let's look at their expenses. They say their expenses are going to be 5,000 a month. There's expected expenses. We're going to increase that by 3% a year. We can change this COLA. That's what you give yourself to try to keep up with inflation. So we got 5,000 increasing by 3% a year, and we're taking Social Security in the very first year, which at 62 is going to get 1,820. So you don't need the 5,000 coming out of your nest egg. You only need 5,000 minus 1,820. So you're going to take 3,180 out of your nest egg. Well, let's go down through here and see how these numbers work out. Again, nobody knows what the future is going to hold. What if we have some really good years before some of these down years that could potentially happen, like what happened in the year 2000? But let's look at 1997 numbers. Let's go down through here. You're taking out 3,180, and you're leaving it all in the S&P 500. Nobody would do this, but I'm just showing you the numbers. If you don't have any in a cash reserve account, but you really do want to have that. But I'm just showing you what's a good asset allocation. This is kind of interesting depending on if you have some really good years. Look at this. After 20 years, you have 1.144 million. Let's go down through here. What if you do a 90-10 split? 90% staying in the S&P 500, 10% going over to some kind of bucket. So when the market's going down, you're taking these monies out of that instead of taking out of the S&P 500, which is already being knocked down. Notice this, folks. After 20 years, you have 1,053,000, an 80-20 split, 985,000, 70-30 split, 791,000, and a 60-40 split, which is often recommended. You have about half of what you would have if you just would have left it all in the S&P 500. Am I saying you leave it all in the S&P 500? No way. Again, I'm not a financial advisor, but you don't want to do that because you want to cover yourself. Because what happens if you start out with some bad years? Well, let's kind of go through this. Right now, the best case scenario is to leave it all in the S&P 500, but probably maybe a 70-30 split would be 791,000. Let's go ahead and go down through there. What happens if we have 1998 numbers where you have 2 good years before you have 3 down years? Then look at the 20-year column. Going down through here again, you got 587,000 after 20 years. You got 568,000 with a 90-10 split, with an 80-20 split. Basically, it's all staying the same. But when you go to 70-30 split, now you're down to 411. And a 60-40 split, you're down to 245. And in fact, you're running out of money. Isn't that interesting with a 60-40 split? Why? Because you want to take advantage of these numbers, but you also know these numbers are sneaking up. These bad years are sneaking up. Again, this is all potential. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. But I thought it was interesting that the higher you get, the more you put over in the cash reserve account, you could actually run into a situation where you run out of money. Okay, let's go to 1999, going back again. We start out with all of it in the S&P 500, just running through changing your asset allocation. In this case, after 20 years, you're down to 48,000. With a 90-10 split, you're down to 8,000. You're actually worse off than if you would have stayed in the S&P 500. Now it's starting to sneak up with an 80-20. You got 59,000. How about a 70-30? Up to 72,000. A 60-40, you're back down. It looks like this 70-30 seems like it's kind of key right there. 80-20 or 70-30. Again, let's go to the actual year 2000. That's when we're going to have a real problem because you start out with 3 down years. You had it all in the stock market, but again, nobody's recommending it. Your money would be gone in 15 years. What about a 90-10 split? Your money lasts 16 years. 80-20 split, your money lasts 18 years. 70-30, which we've seen that works quite often. That's running out of money in 18 years. And here's the standard 60-40, still 18 years. So it looks like that 60-40 doesn't really help much either if we have 3 down years. Now, obviously, if the higher you go here, you're going to eventually reach a point where if you don't have any in the stock market, you aren't going to get hurt by these down years. For example, right here, got gone in 18 years. It's still 18 years. Look at this, folks, doing down here. It takes until you do a 80% over in your cash reserve account and only 20% in here, which makes sense. If the market's going down and you had returns like that, then you'd finally have some money left after 20 years. Let's go to 90%. Well, you're back to running out of money. Isn't that interesting? Why is that? Because this cash reserve account right here, if you're taking out 5% and your cash reserve, your bucket over here isn't paying you 5%, you're going to be hurting anyway. I just ran it at 3%. Well, let's just change this to 4%, for example, if you could find a really good, then you actually have some money left. But it all depends on what you're getting on that cash reserve account. But you're getting so far away from the potential what the S&P 500 can do for you. So if you think you're going to have some really bad years like the year 2000, but if you do most any other year, all these years, this is what you have after 20 years, leaving it all in the S&P 500, 90-10, 80-20, 70-30, 60-40. You want to take advantage of these if you have some really good years. And even if you let's go down to 2001, where you only had 2 down years before you had a problem. Again, we're starting with leaving it all in the S&P 500. Again, we don't recommend that. I'm not a financial advisor, but don't do it because you got to have something to cover when the down years. You have 79,000 if you left it all. 90-10, look at that, 200,000. 80-20, 229,000. 70-30, starting to go back down. 127,000 down to 41,000. 76, it looks like 70-30 or even 80-20 is the best case scenario. That's if you're starting out with 2 down years, because you want to eventually take advantage of these comeback years, which has happened over and over and over again. Even in the Depression years, you had some really good returns there. The trouble is you had too many down years in that range also. You had 6 down years in that decade in 1930s. But look at how some of these returns came back. Even when we had 2 down years in 1970, it came back nicely, 37 up 23. You had some really good years, of course, the 80s and the 90s. But look what's happened since the year 2000. After we had these 3 down years, we had some really good years. Yes, we had down 37, but look how it came back, folks. So that's what we do in this channel. We run all kinds of different scenarios. What's a good asset allocation? According to the numbers, if you stick to like an 80-20 or a 70-30, that seems like, given whatever scenario you can come up with, you're almost best off with a 70-30 or an 80-20 as opposed to a 60-40. But again, that's just running the numbers. That all depends on when these negative years happen, because they do happen. And what's really damaging is when they hit consecutively, like we saw in the year 2000. Then we had problems running out of money, but we saw the asset allocation really didn't change much whether you went an 80-20, out of money in 18 years, 70-30, out of money in 18 years, 60-40, out of money in 19 years. So it looks like that range out of 50%, 19 years. So it looks like maybe the 80-20 and the 70-30, according to the numbers for the last 100 years, probably the best case scenario right there is to keep that asset allocation so you can benefit when the market does come back with these kind of returns, which it keeps doing over and over and over again over the last 100 years. That's what we do on this channel. We just kind of wanted to look at the 60-40 split that's often recommended and saw that maybe a 70-30 or an 80-20 might be better off. Again, it depends on what's happening those initial years, and nobody knows what's going to happen. I just thought I'd run the numbers. I thought that was interesting to just see where somebody would be with changing the asset allocation once they get to retirement. But maybe not cut it back so much as people might recommend, 50-50 or 60-40. That's what we do in this channel. We run numbers for people. Please consider subscribing to this channel. Share it with others. Let people know there's a channel out there that will run numbers for people. Um, we just like to cover some of the discussions that are going on in financial channels right now. What's a good asset allocation once you reach retirement? And we just ran the numbers for you. Thanks for watching.